Hello and welcome to the Hindus Parley podcast, where we discuss an issue that has animated the past week's news cycle. We attempt to present a question and elicit two contrarian views, but there have been instances of agreement or just more insight that might lead to larger questions. Now, on November 23rd, the incumbent Bharatiya Janata Party led Mahayuti alliance won a landslide victory at the assembly polls held a few days earlier than that. The alliance got almost 50% of the vote share, with the BJP alone bagging 132 seats, which is nearly a majority in the 288 strong assembly. Among the several reasons credited for this victory was the implementation of the Ladli Behin welfare scheme, an initiative introduced by the Maharashtra government in July 2024, just about 4 months ahead of the assembly elections. The scheme, much like its Madhya Pradesh counterpart, also introduced ahead of assembly elections there, aims to provide financial assistance to women from economically weaker sections between the ages of 21 and 65 and those who make less than rupees 2.5 lakh annually, with a monthly stipend of 1500 rupees directly transferred to their bank accounts. Many have now come to question such schemes as tantamounting to bribing voters by incumbent governments and giving them an unfair advantage. I have with me to discuss this particular question Vikas Rawal from the JNU's School of Economics and Social Planning. And I also have Reetika Khera from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences from IIT Delhi. Thank you both for joining me on this conversation today. So, if I can start with you, Professor Rawal, several have called this as financial inclusion. Several critiques have also welcomed it as at least a short cap measure, if not a wholesome measure of enabling larger purchasing power. But when they are introduced by incumbent governments so close to the elections, does it really tantamount to being a bribe? Your response.
Kunal, let me first say two things. One is, I think that having social welfare programs and having social welfare programs in response to popular needs of people, in response, and these are reflected through political processes, is okay and is necessary. But that said, as you pointed out, if this happens just before elections, if it is accompanied by weakening systems of evaluation, independent evaluation, regulation, and so on, and since if it does not result in establishing robust systems of social welfare and merely ends at providing election soaps which are not really long lasting in terms of being able to provide social welfare that they're supposed to provide, then there is a problem.
Right. Okay. If it is at least effective in its in what it attempts to achieve, then there is at
You
least
see,
some
so
merit to it.
social welfare programs, I mean, political parties, governments have always used social. It's only natural that they have political benefits in mind when they start social welfare programs. And that's always been the case. But if this
Right.
happens just on the eve of the elections, and then if it is accompanied by undermining systems of evaluation, ensuring that these are actually reaching people that they're supposed to reach, if these are accompanied with massive leakages, and systems of regulation, accountability are weakened to allow that to happen, then that's a problem.
Ritika, if I can come to you, how do you view this?
Yeah.
These, yeah.
So, not so long ago in the southern states, the parties were promising mixers and grinders. And at that time, the media labeled these electoral manifesto promises as freebies. And I think of cash transfers just as a modern avatar of those electoral promises. Earlier, it used to be fans and mixer grinders, and now it's cash. And I think labeling them as bribes would be wrong. It was wrong to label electoral promises such as fans and mixers as freebies, and it is wrong to label cash transfers right now as bribes. I think it is, I mean, I have, maybe we can talk about it later. I have some reservations about certain kinds of cash transfers, even though I support other kinds of cash transfers like old age pensions and maternity benefits. But I think what you're probably getting at is that these promises are a reflection of the flaw in our democracy. The only time that ordinary people get a hearing and are remembered by political parties is at the time of elections. And it is a pity that the electoral promises are reduced to small, visible, and short term gains, such as these cash transfers. But for those who are on the margins and largely ignored by the powers that be, they'll just take what they get, right? Much more reflection. This is much more a reflection of the small mindedness of political parties than obviously on the side of voters. And then there's a separate thing is how much do such promises, whether they are mixer grinders or cash transfers, how much do they actually influence voter behavior? I don't know the answer to that. But as a voter, what would stop me from taking what is due to me through such interventions and yet applying my mind independently to what is a pressing issue for the country and deciding who to vote for according to what I think are pressing issues?
Right. So it's wrong to, you're saying it's wrong to call them bribes now, and it was, as you said, it is wrong to call what, for instance, Jayalalitha, the late chief minister of Tamil Nadu, had initiated with even giving free televisions, etc. When she was in power as a sort of as freebies. Um,
Can I quickly add to that?
yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead.
That I think the basic point is that whenever people, ordinary people, are getting a hearing, it's immediately picked up as, something problematic. And that tendency has to be resisted. The only time normal, regular people in India, the poor especially, get a hearing from the electoral, I mean, the political bosses is at the time of election. So they just take what they get.
Right. As Vikas, you pointed out, this isn't just by governments. I mean, by governments in India, it's actually quite a global practice by various governments in elected democracies. We witnessed that particularly even by conservative governments post COVID-19, when cash transfers were expanded to across the board to everyone to increase purchasing power, even by the first Trump administration and Boris Johnson's government in the UK. So, does this really sway voter behavior? Is that something that, or are we, are we being a little too, shall we say, not quite crediting the voter with enough intelligence to make those decisions?
I want to make 2 points. One is that I think there is a need for us to distinguish between how what these do, their efficacy and impact, both in terms of social welfare and voter behavior, in countries like India and in developed countries like UK or US. I think one needs to make a distinction. Efficacy of cash transfers. I mean, cash transfers, as Ritika rightly pointed out, cash transfers of a certain kind are important and very useful. But cash transfers of a certain other kind, large scale transfers like what's being done in PM Kisan, in context of developing countries, are questionable as whether they are the right kind of instruments for achieving what you're trying to achieve. If one is thinking of moving away from various other forms of public support to agriculture to direct cash transfers like the PM Kisan, I would be very worried. So I think there is a distinction in the sheer efficacy of cash transfers as a measure in different contexts. The other thing is that it is actually rather unfortunate that in the Indian context, sometimes even very small cash transfers. I mean, look at PM Kisan as an example. It was 6,000 rupees a year per farmer family. It's nothing. Just look at it in terms of even cost of agriculture. 6,000 is a pittance. And it has remained at 6,000 from 2019. Government has not bothered to increase it even to adjust for inflation. And this is often the case with cash transfers in less developed countries, that these remain a pretense, they are not adjusted for inflation, and they remain tiny handouts. And unfortunately, despite that being the case, because of the way they are introduced, because of the way they are brought just in time before elections, and at that moment it seems like something, they do affect voter behavior. They do change voter behavior. But the point is that governments that do social welfare have always benefited from it. Have always, I mean, governments that have strengthened PDS in India have always come back to power. I mean, it's an incredible record. Now, the point is that you have governments that use it positively to develop strong systems of social welfare and then take the political benefit from it. And there are those that use it as just a tool at the time of election, introduce something and then let it fall, leave it to be neglected and wither away.
Right. So, how would you then, describe or assess the current set of cash transfers, like this Ladli Behin scheme, both in case of Madhya Pradesh and in Maharashtra? Vikas.
I would say, I mean, you need a lot more. I mean, you see, the point is that as a system of social support, I mean, if governments provide something to the poor, to large masses of people, okay, that's a good thing. Okay, it just needs to be strengthened. It should not be a pretense that is barely enough to deal with the problems, the crisis of employment that people are facing, the inflation that's taking place, etc. If it's just a tiny handout, it's just too little. No, so I mean, if what I would say is governments need to have to create much stronger systems of social welfare that should include not just cash transfers but also a lot of other services and in-kind transfers, a much bigger PDS. I mean, look at you were talking about COVID pandemic. We had 120 million tons of grain, the largest public stocks. We did not expand the coverage of PDS. We did not say, we have, millions of tons of grain lying in our godowns. Whoever needs grain can come and buy it from the ration shop. It doesn't matter whether you're a migrant worker, where you are, whether you have a ration card or not. If during the period of this crisis you need grain, here we
Here
have the
is
grain.
it is available
We
and
did
you
not
can
say
come and
that.
take
We
it.
did
Right.
not
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah.
We said we are
Right.
doubling it for those who have ration cards. But if you don't have a ration card, sorry, we don't care.
Sorry, that's right. Yeah, yeah, right. So yes, I think I'll pick up from the question that you from the issue that you just raised. That is this a failure of the government's imagination, in fact, to provide better livelihoods, for instance, jobs that you said. So are these cash transfers in that case a tacit admission of the government's failure to either create meaningful employment, right, for India's burgeoning working age population, or even for that matter to spur private sector in doing so? Because as we noticed ahead of the elections of 2024, the finance minister often sort of complained that the private sector, which has been given so many sops, have not really lived up to the expectation of creating jobs. So maybe if I can begin with Ritika and then come to Vikas.
Yeah, so very quickly, earlier you raised the question of cash transfers by the Trump presidency and by Johnson after COVID, or during COVID rather. I think one thing to bear in mind is that the welfare provisioning in those countries, even in the US, by the way, is better than in India. Just let me give you a quick example. One, of course, is the NHS, which provides healthcare for all in UK. And in the US, at the primary level, less than 10% of children are enrolled in private schools, whereas in India it's about 30 to 40%, perhaps even more than 40% now. So you can see that in a country like India, health and education, which are core functions of the government, are getting neglected. And so then the question arises, do these cash transfers displace spending on health and education? Yeah, that's one important question that I think, from the point of view of the women who get the cash transfers, these are very welcome, because they're really, in a very bad situation often. But what what is it taking away from, if anything, fiscally? That's one important question. The other important question, since you're talking about Ladli Behna, I was looking at, what are the objectives? And I think Vikas also mentioned this. What are they trying to achieve? So there are three things at least which I've come across. One, they say economic independence for women. Another, they say health and nutrition, to improve their health and nutrition outcome. And the third thing they say, especially in Tamil Nadu, it was compensation for all the unpaid domestic work. And I think all of these raise questions. So the first one is economic independence. Isn't that better? And this comes to the question you asked. Isn't that better achieved by making employment opportunities available to them? Why is the central government starving NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, of funds? Isn't that a better way? And in fact, it would give women much more money. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, they're getting 12,000 rupees a year at 1,000 rupees a month. And if they were to get 100 days of employment, they would get 29,000 rupees a year. So it's more than double what they get through these direct cash transfers. And I talked to a woman recently in Chengalpattu, and she said she absolutely prefers the 100 days of work over this, because she, in any case, she was a bit anxious about if the political party changed, would these cash transfers continue. The second objective of health and nutrition, through that can also be achieved much better through providing eggs in Anganwadis and midday meals. And I know people in Tamil Nadu, for them all this is old hat, but in many North Indian states, children are not getting nutritious food. Another thing that Vikas mentioned is about the PDS. Why aren't we including oil and dal? Yesterday, I was speaking to someone who's doing research in Koppal and Chamarajnagar in Karnataka, and they mentioned that they talk to women who are getting this additional Annabhagya cash, and they are very unhappy because they said, why don't you give us nutritious items? We much prefer that. And the third objective, which is this compensation for unpaid domestic work, I mean, are you then saying that, okay, women are supposed to be doing domestic work only, and then they should just be given some
And
money for
therefore,
it? And in
right.
fact, it would
Yeah.
be much
Yeah.
better to think harder about how to change gender norms. So I think the problem with this is not to see it as a bribe or, cheap ways of getting votes, but rather what are they trying to achieve? Where do they fit into our conception and vision of a welfare state and the architecture of this welfare state?
Right. So, I mean, going back to now that you raised Manrega, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, of course, if we consider that as a sort of a holistic welfare scheme, it did give money. It did put money in the hands of just about I mean millions of farmers across India with the 100-day job scheme, and it did bring back the UPA government. I mean, was largely credited for getting the UPA government back to a power for another term, right? So, could this question be then twisted to say that that also could have amounted to a sort of a bribe, or is that is that also reducing the again, as you said, it reducing the larger issue of welfare itself as if being viewed as sort of tokenistic approaches? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
Vikas, go
but
ahead.
Kunal, I think we have both agreed that I mean, I think at least Vitika and I have both agreed that it's not correct to term these as bribes. And look at
Yes.
NREGA. In fact, NREGA is a classic example of what is not a bribe. I mean, you have created such a robust framework for NREGA that even a government that's completely ideologically opposed to it has not been able to undo it. A government that's damned NREGA has not been able to undo it, has been forced to uh, acknowledge its importance, and has been forced to carry it forward. You
Although it has
created an
reduced it
institutional frame.
drastically in across the
Well,
country. Although I was just,
not
yeah,
quite
yeah.
reduced. There are, yes, there are problems that they have created, but not quite reduced in that sense. It is inadequate. It needs to be expanded. They often uh, don't give the money that the scheme needs. They have refused to expand it to urban areas. There are those issues, but they've not been able to undo it, roll it back, withdraw the act, and so on. You created a robust institutional framework, legal framework, and a demand, a popular demand for it, that it would be difficult for a government to take it away. So it is actually a very interesting example of how welfare should be done. Now, the thing is that you need a lot more. The point is that, I mean, India's social welfare spending is just too little, too low. And I don't think it's a question of, should you transfer the money that you're spending on cash transfers to NREGA. You should just expand your social welfare spending. You need to raise resources. You need to tax the rich. You need to, you know, uh, instead of giving soaps to the rich, you should be giving spending on social welfare. You should be spending on healthcare. I mean, you are paying a pittance to your A&Ms and Anganwadi workers and midday meal workers. I mean, you need to do those things. You need to increase your social welfare spending. That's what we need.
Right. So clearly, both of you have agreed on one thing, that these cannot be termed as bribes, even if they are short-term fixes that are being weaponized by incumbent governments to let's say come back to power. And also that these are inadequate in the larger basket of what we might view as larger welfare schemes that populations across developing countries need. So one scheme that does stand out, akin to what Ritika was earlier saying about not just being cash transfers but addressing an issue, is the Arogya Lakshmi scheme, which the Telangana Rashtra Samiti government attempted in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe I think even earlier, 2015, just after it came to power, in its first term. Do you think that sort of a scheme, which is more to address nutrition of women and girls, uh, you know, instead of cash transfers, or maybe they should be both together, maybe cash transfers and that address the larger issue of, say, malnutrition among women and etc. Ritika, first with you, and then to Vikas.
Yeah. So, very quickly, I want to say that as far as these promises of cash are concerned, I think the media should really reflect on its tendency to term them as bribes or freebies. But that doesn't mean these cash transfers are without any reservations or concerns or questions should not be asked. The main question in my mind, number one, is related to fiscal issues. Are these cash transfers taking away from other spending? Is it taking away from welfare spending of other kinds? So, just to give you some kind of ballpark thing, Karnataka's cash transfer budget, I think, for this financial year is 28,000 crores. Okay, that's twice as much as the union budget on midday meals. So it's a big amount. Same thing with, and of course, Karnataka has some resources. Even in Jharkhand, we didn't talk about there. They did exactly the same as Maharashtra. They also introduced Maya Yojana, which is also a cash transfer to women. So that's the big question, I would say, about these cash transfers. Now, you asked about whether other kinds of cash transfers are desirable. See, I feel that like I said, I have reservations about some cash transfers while I support others. I think that the National Food Security Act, for instance, which is taking a sort of life cycle approach, they have maternity benefits for pregnant and lactating women. They have the Anganwadi for under six. They have midday meals for school going children. And then there's the PDS. Now, the maternity benefits is a cash transfer program, right? It's 6,000 rupees through the Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana. That is basically fixing a big gap in our welfare architecture. We had the maternity benefits for women in the organized sector since 1961 or something like that. But most women are working in the unorganized sector, and their right to maternity benefits was not recognized until this 2013 Food Security Act. So in that case, I support a cash transfer. It can do all kinds of things for women. As far as health and nutrition needs are concerned, and this goes to the scheme from Telangana that you were talking about, I feel that in-kind interventions can be much more effective, because often nutrition education is not adequate amongst people, so they may not know that they should eat protein-rich foods. And the Anganwadis, and especially the southern states, have become a way of providing black gram, eggs, and other very nutrient-rich foods for both pregnant and lactating women as well as children under 6. So I feel that yes, there is a place for cash transfers, but like I said earlier, right, these cash transfers that we're currently talking about are trying to do something where there may be better solutions, and that really depends on a
Right.
case by case basis. And I think that I have to say, since I'm saying raising so many questions about these cash transfers to women, I do want to say that the women who get it appreciate it a lot, because for instance, this woman I met in Chengalpattu, her husband drinks, and on top of that, he has a disability. So he's not earning, and he's not really supportive in other ways either. And she's the one who was really anxious, what if this stops? And she said, yeah, I much prefer work through NREGA to this, because that would give me much more. So even economic independence, I think, is better achieved through, say, NREGA, or even better work. I mean, NREGA doesn't necessarily give enough or well paid work, and sometimes the work itself can be not very satisfying.
Right. Right. Vikas, your response?
Yeah, Kunal, very quickly. I think schemes that involve provision of food, either in cooked food, best if they provide cooked food, but even if they provide grain, even if they provide other kinds of food, are always better. They have always had very positive impact. So schemes of that kind have historically been extremely effective. So there's no question about that. The other thing I want to mention is that if you just look at the implementation of welfare schemes since the 1980s at least, you see, we had various systems of evaluation, independent evaluation. Planning Commission used to have an evaluation wing. There are all kinds of ways in which independent evaluation was done within the government, by others. A national sample survey would have survey questions that one could use to assess what was happening to schemes. CAG would do audits of performance audits of different schemes. All of those have been undermined. All of those have been
Right.
undermined. Every question that could be used to look at efficacy of a social welfare program has dropped from NSS surveys. If you had a portal that could be used to assess whether fertilizer was reaching farmers, that portal is shut down when fertilizer crisis hits. So you see, we have a situation where evaluation of government programs has been systematically undermined. In particular, independent evaluation has been systematically undermined, and that's a very, very serious problem, particularly in a period when you are doing these kinds of cash transfers, when you have other kind of evidence that's suggesting that there may be massive cases of corruption in some of these. Okay, you have actually created a situation where any possibility of, I mean, I had been part of a survey 2 years back in a village in Madhya Pradesh where spending of about 40 lakhs was shown in a welfare program, but that had not happened. The money was not there. Nothing had been done. So, those kinds of things. I mean, recently there was this case of a IAS officer in Odisha who had sort of diverted money. So, there are many cases of that kind, but systematic, established methods of evaluation and accountability have been undermined in the recent years. And that is a serious problem.
And if you look at, I mean, often the reason given for such cash transfers is that it plugs so-called leakages, right? What they mean is corruption in the system, which takes away the benefits that were given in kind earlier. For instance, the LPG
It's
subsidy,
exactly the
etc.
opposite. It's exactly
Right.
the opposite. And historically, schemes that have involved provision of goods and services, provision of food, provision of employment, provision of health facilities, provision of schooling facilities, have school uniforms are the schemes where actually leakages are less.
Well,
The schemes that have involved direct cash transfers are the schemes which have always had high leakages. And now you don't even have a system of regulation and monitoring.
I'm not.
Right.
I
So,
think I have a slightly different view on this. On corruption, I mean, I think cash. See, there were two big issues with earlier interventions, right? Whenever we talked about a welfare intervention, one is corruption, and the second one was targeting. On corruption, I think they were it was an issue in the PDS. Has been an issue in NREGA, and it remains an issue in these cash transfer programs. So I don't think that we have to be vigilant. Basically, we have to be vigilant no matter which scheme, what kind form the transfer takes. And in the case of these DBTs, what is happening is that it's created a whole army of middlemen through whom these so-called direct benefits are transferred. They're actually not direct at all, because in many rural areas there is no proper banking network, and so you have these business correspondents or banking correspondents, pragya kendras, etc., where people have to go and withdraw their money, and there is very little regulatory frame. Like for the banks, there is a pretty good regulatory framework, right? Even in rural areas, there is a culture of working in a particular way. But these business correspondents, etc., they're just like middlemen of, earlier they were cheating on cement and bricks and wages, and now they are still cheating on wages whenever they can. Aadhaar has been a big part of this problem. So I think corruption is always something to be vigilant about. I don't think we should assume that leakages have gone away with cash transfers at all. And of course, the other problem, which you haven't really touched on, is the targeting problem, right? With NREGA, the big attraction was that only those who were not getting work at the minimum wage would show up for NREGA work. But in these cash transfers, there aren't such robust self-targeting mechanisms. And so we don't have enough evaluation of they're very new, so we don't have evaluations of how well or badly they're doing on targeting questions.
or for that matter, as Vikas pointed out, the evaluation of whether they have in fact achieved any sort of the outcomes that they have set out to achieve.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I think that's partly
right.
because they're so new, right? So, but there's no attempt even, it seems, to evaluate them.
Right. So both of you agree that there needs to be a robust sort of monitoring and evaluation process that needs to be sort of framed within for these cash transfers that have now grown and expanded by not just the central government but by the state governments as well. So and both of you do agree that we cannot call these bribes, and it's really a sort of a bad framing, not just of the media, but largely whenever it comes to welfare programs delivered through the government. Well, I think on that note, thank you so much, both of you, for this very insightful conversation. And I do hope we haven't had audio glitches in the process, uh, and we've captured most of this conversation. And for those of who are our listeners of the Parley podcast, do tune in every week for such insightful conversations with experts across the field. Bye for now.